This week, we're going to talk about culture and specifically why this concept of culture is so important. Because culture is one of the hallmarks of humanity, right? And particularly the fact that we are able to adapt so quickly and kind of change our behavior so quickly through these cultural and technological ways of coping with environmental conditions, right? These are really considered hallmarks of our species. We will start out by talking about how we define culture and what its defining features are. We will discuss briefly the evolutionary basis for culture and what aspects of it we share with non human species. And then we will specifically talk about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. These are kind of frameworks with which we can view the world and describe um, other populations of people. We will then talk about how these tie into this discussion of whether or not we possess universal human rights. And then lastly, we will talk about agents or mechanisms of cultural change. So there is no doubt that we are not the only species that possesses society. We define society as organized life in groups. But this doesn't mean that other species possess a culture that is elaborated to the same degree that human culture is. And so we've got to understand really what this difference is between organized life in groups living in societies and what we mean by culture. Great apes have been argued to have what we would consider rudimentary cultural abilities, but this idea of fully elaborated cultures are unique to humanity. And so these are often defined as distinctive traditions and customs that are transmitted over generations through learning and through language. And so that is why, at least in part, why we're grouping together these lectures on what we consider culture and looking at linguistics and linguistic anthropology. Culture has also often been described as anything that is not culture. And we can't really define a term by saying that it's anything that isn't not that term, right? Um, Tyler, a 19th century British anthropologist, defined cultures as systems of human behavior and thought that can be studied scientifically because they obey natural laws. And we recognize that culture is something that we learn, and specifically, human children learn what culture they belong to and the cultural traditions that they express through this process of enculturation. So that still doesn't really tell us what culture is, right? So we've got to look at some of these defining features of culture to determine what qualifies as a cultural trait. So we're going to have five defining features of culture. Okay, the first one of these is that culture is learned. Cultural learning depends on our capacity to use symbols. Symbols are defined as signs that have no necessary or natural connection to the things they stand for or signify. One definition of culture defines it as ideas that are based on learning and symbols, with cultures functioning as control mechanisms or programs that govern behavior. Um, Symbols are things that we eventually internalize their meanings. Through this process of enculturation, we come to learn that certain symbols uh, obey as being defined as having certain kinds of meaning, and we internalize that, and that meaning then becomes very true for us. This will then help guide an individual's behavior and perceptions throughout their lives. And we learn these symbols and their meanings through a variety of avenues, including direct instruction, observation, experience, interaction with others, conscious and unconscious behavior modification. So let's think about some of the aspects of our culture that are defined by the symbols that we use. Language is one obvious uh, factor that absolutely is built upon previously established meanings of symbols, right? The idea of having an alphabet, for example, right? Our alphabet is symbolic, meaning that there's nothing inherent in the meaning of a letter or a word or a spoken word or whatever, right? That is tied to that particular item that it represents. And so think about, for example, how we would spell apple, right? When we're communicating the word apple, we would convey that through apple, right? We would talk about how the a makes an ah sound, the p makes a p sound, right? But there's nothing inherent about in, in the way that we kind of connect those sounds to the letters that stand for them, right? This is not like, for an example, us using some sort of pictograph language. Pictograph languages can be what we call iconic. We'll talk about this a little bit with this next lecture, looking at linguistics and talking about what great apes are capable of, because chimpanzees and bonobos have been taught to use lexigram boards that have non-iconic um, symbols for the things that they represent. So the symbol for an apple then in that kind of context is not going to be just a picture of an apple. If we use a picture of an apple to describe an apple, right, that's iconic. That is doesn't leave any kind of room for interpretation, doesn't require any sort of abstract thought or connection. And so that is this aspect of learned culture that is so important, is that it is abstract in nature, that the way that we figure out what symbols stand for is through this process of enculturation, but that these symbols are non-iconic, right? So think about where you stop for coffee when you're out and about, right? There's nothing inherent in a sign that has a double mermaid's tail that conveys to us that coffee should be available at that particular place of business. But my daughter, by the time she was about 9 months of age, could recognize the sign for Starbucks and would vocalize by going whenever we would pass by Starbucks, essentially basically asking for us to stop at Starbucks. So, babies are really primed as they're learning language to also learn symbols and to associate these meaningful connections between symbols and what they stand for. All right, so let's think of another example, right? Because really, talking about alphabets and stuff, we're talking about language systems, and culture doesn't only exist in linguistic kind of settings. So let's think about the American flag, right? What does it stand for? The answer to that question is very, very tightly going to be tied to people's lived experiences, right? If you're an immigrant to the US, the American flag might stand for hope, right? Economic hope, safety, etc. If you are uh, someone who's lived in the United States for a really long time and have historically been in positions of power, then you might say freedom, democracy, the American way, the American dream, etc. If you are a BIPOC individual, a Black or Indigenous person of color, that American flag may come with a lot of negative connotations. It might represent oppression, it might represent institutionalized racism, right? So our interpretations of a symbol as simple as the flag for our country gets tied up into shared lived experiences, and we learn how to assign that meaning to these symbols by kind of how we're treated and how those symbols are treated throughout our early lives. And so, cultural traditions, symbolic meaning that we learn in our youth, um, I mean, we're primed when we're young to learn to associate cultural symbols and meaning, right? And so it's really super easy for children to learn language. It's really super easy for children to learn um, number systems. It's really super easy for children to learn to recognize our flag and to develop some kind of identity or statement as to what it stands for. And that identity or meaning is going to be different for different people, precisely because our lived experiences and what that flag represents is going to be different for different people. All right, so the first feature of culture is that it's learned. The second feature of culture is that it is symbolic. A symbol is something that is verbal or nonverbal within a particular language or culture that comes to stand for something else. And White actually proposed that culture originated in our evolutionary history when our ancestors acquired the ability to use symbols to originate and bestow meaning on a thing or an event. And so we talked already, as we talked about hominin evolution, we talked about this idea of the advent of behavioral modernity, right? Where humans started to behave in a modern way, even though for quite some time they had appeared in a modern way, let's say, right, where humans became fully modern in both appearance and behavior. Symbols are often linguistic, but they can be nonverbal. So we were talking about the double mermaid tail, for example, right? That is not a linguistic symbol. That is a logo for a business. Flags, religious iconography, all of those things are nonverbal symbols. And so, one of the interesting features or ways in which this idea of culture being symbolic relates to humanity as a whole is this point where we started to build entire communication um, s- systems based on symbolic thought and symbols themselves, right? And so predominantly or first and foremost, this developed through um, the possession of language. Language is considered a distinctive possession of Homo sapiens. We could say that this is potentially debatable, and we'll talk about how in lecture 8. But there's no doubt that once we develop fully modern language, linguistic expression, that it is symbolic in nature. The words that we use to stand for um, certain objects, certain ideas, right? The alphabets that we use to try to write our language. Everything about a linguistic system, our linguistic systems are symbolic in nature. And we can say, even if non-human primates, particularly great apes, possess um, some of these rudimentary cultural abilities, which I would argue that we do see that present in at least chimpanzees and bonobos, that fully elaborated cultural abilities are distinctive to Homo and particularly Homo sapiens. But I would also argue that these rudimentary building blocks for symbolic thought and symbolic communication that we see in our closest non-human relatives, right? That these are really indicative of kind of a latent cognition that was present even from our earliest hominid ancestors. So we had fully elaborated culture, though culture that was to some degree different with Homo erectus, right? The fact that Homo erectus could develop this mental template of what they were going to turn um, this kind of core rock into, right? This mental template of tool making, this mental template of potentially crafting boats in how Homo erectus spread to uh, areas outside of kind of continental Africa and Asia. So we don't see just one event uh, that where humans essentially kind of wake up and develop into fully functioning humans, right? This is important. There's an interesting book by an anthropologist by the name of Augustine Fuentes called "The Human Spark." That's really talking about like this aspect of creativity and ascribing meaning to these symbols. And so Augustine Fuentes would say that we can often define or describe an animal based on the universal ecological niche in which that animal resides. And so we can talk about animals being arboreal, right? Terrestrial, fossorial. I mean, the arboreal and terrestrial, arboreals in trees, terrestrials on the ground. Fossorial means that they would be digging species, right? That there's some universal ecological niche that different animal species inhabit, and many of their adaptations can be explained on the basis of that universal ecological niche. Um, Fuentes would go so far as to say that even humans have a universal ecological niche. And I like to pose this to undergrads, right? What would our universal ecological niche be? And this is really fun to do when we've got in-person face-to-face instruction, and we can actually kind of talk about the implications of this. Students will often say, well, we're terrestrial, and yes, we are terrestrial, but that really isn't a function of like defining our humanity or our key traits. Because we could live all of our lives on a boat, right? We could live all of our lives in a series of tree houses that are interconnected, right? There's nothing about our adaptations that are entirely based on our terrestriality. Um, Augustine Fuentes would go so far as to say that the universal human environment or ecological niche is a semiotic niche. SEMIOTIC. And that it is really this focus on semiotics that defines humanity. We've got to ask ourselves, what does that mean? What is a semiotic um, niche, right? And semiotic means that basically that we're always trying to ascribe meaning to things. Okay, that our universal ecological niche is one based on symbols and the meanings that we ascribe to those symbols, and that it doesn't matter what people you're looking at, where on the earth you're collecting your data. It doesn't matter what the complexity is of their linguistic system. It doesn't matter whether they've got 11 phonemes in their language or 108 phonemes, right? That every aspect about human culture is going to be tied up into how that particular population of humans ascribes meaning, and that applies to our art, that applies to our architecture, that applies to our writing, that applies to our language systems, that applies to our religious beliefs. It applies to applies to every aspect of humanity, and that is really tightly tied to this focus on symbolic aspects, right? Why do these symbols have meaning? Well, because we've given them meaning, right? Religious iconography. Why is a cross pervasive symbol of Christianity, for example? Well, because of um, the mythology and folklore that surrounds how meaning is ascribed in Christianity, and of course, particularly the crucifixion of um, Jesus Christ, right? So we are very, very quick to ascribe meaning, and I kind of it's there have been some interesting memes or comics that have come out of this, right? Basically saying that We are quick to interpret every cave painting and every petroglyph, etc., as having significant kind of religious connotations or to tie into their folklore or to be some sort of entreaty to the gods, perhaps, etc. When sometimes it's just doodles, right? When sometimes people are carving things just because they're kind of bored, right? So we're quick as humans to recognize that other humans before us have given symbols meaning, and we spend our time of investigation trying to figure out what that meaning system would be, right? All right, so the third defining feature of culture is that culture is shared. It's an attribute not of individuals, but instead as an attribute that comes with being a member of a group. So we can think about language again here, right? If you ever had like a club that you and your friends created, right? One of the things that we did when we were creating clubs as children was we developed our own language system. You know, for us, that was often something along the lines of Pig Latin. I mean, my son and his friends have mastered speaking languages like Klingon and Elvish and Orc. So uh, it doesn't have to be Pig Latin. It doesn't have to be. It can be something that you invent yourself. It can be something that you co-opt um, from mass media. But the point being that a language doesn't have any meaning if you're the only one who speaks it, right? The only way that language develops meaning is when it is shared by members of a group. And that it is in that aspect of being shared that really gives language that symbolic meaning. So enculturation is one of the mechanisms by which people become unified because they share common experiences, they share beliefs, values, memories, and expectations. So there's something to be said for the culture that you learn when you're young and kind of your nostalgia for it. It doesn't mean um, that cultures that you or cultural features that you learn later in life don't carry with them a lot of meaning. It's just that we are often wistful for the good old days, right? We often ascribe particular symbolism to things that we were enculturated to when we were young, and this is one of those reasons why it's easier to change people's behavior when they're young because they're primed for learning and sharing all sorts of aspects of culture. All right, the fourth feature of culture is that it is all encompassing. Defined anthropologically, culture encompasses features that are sometimes regarded as trivial or unworthy of serious study, such as pop culture. All people have an equal capacity for culture. Okay, what is it that's the distinctive human trait? It is not a particular cultural feature. It is rather that we have the ability to express culture and to learn culture, right? So humans have an innate biological capacity to learn culture, but the particular features of the culture that humans learn are based on what they experience, are based on what they experience when they're young, kind of through their upbringing. So we are primed, for example, to learn language. But in the case of foreign adoption, we're not going to naturally learn to speak the language of our heritage or people, right? We're going to learn to speak the language that we're exposed to. And so there was that tendency in the like 80s and 90s. There were a lot of young girls from China that were adopted into American families before China kind of put the stop to international adoptions and started really favoring adoption within their own country. And these girls did not grow up like predisposed to speak Mandarin or Cantonese, right? They didn't grow up predisposed um, to prefer to eat lo mein instead of hamburgers, right? The things that these children developed an interest in were the things that were important to the families they were adopted into. The language that these girls expressed was based upon the language that they heard on a daily basis, not some language that they were kind of removed from in this context of international adoption. So this just demonstrates that importance of exposure, right? That you've got to be exposed to the particular cultural features that you will eventually express and internalize. And so all people have this equal capacity for culture. Um, but the culture specifically that we express is based on the culture that we are exposed to. And there's this kind of a carryover of colonialism where we rank things as being civilized versus not civilized. There's no meaning to that in the sense of academically, when we examine cultural features, um, those that have historically been defined as civilized, like the opera and the ballet and the theater, there's nothing inherent in those particular cultural practices that makes them better. Rather, we have given them some form of what we call um, a symbolic capital, right? We have basically arbitrarily made up that certain cultural expressions are going to be considered more valuable or more quote unquote cultured, and that's yeah, that it's entirely a cultural creation. So, um, if we look at the TV culture, right? There's nothing inherently better about the nightly news or 60 Minutes than keeping up with the Kardashians, right? That even seemingly trivial uh, areas of culture, pop culture, etc., that even those that seem trivial are worthy of study and exist as uniquely elaborated cultural features. So, if we want to understand North American culture, we've got to think about social media, cell phones, the internet, television, fast food restaurants, sports, and games. Right? We can't understand current North American culture without understanding the activities and behaviors um, that most people practice, right? There is, for example, you can now get a university degree. I think it's um, someplace like Dartmouth, but I could be wrong on where on what school has it. But there are schools now where you can get degrees in memetics or the study of memes. Right? If you told this to people 30 years ago, they would have found this laughable. What do you mean people are going to get degrees in like memes and symbolism in memes? So even seemingly trivial things become worthy of study. And then our last defining feature is that culture is integrated. It's integrated by the dominant economic activities and related social patterns, integrated through sets of values, ideas, symbols, and judgments. And so we sometimes talk about core values, these key, basic, central values that define certain cultural traditions. If we talked about the core values of the United States, we would say things like democracy, right? We would say things like freedom, liberty, etc. And so, every aspect of our culture is tied in some way to every other aspect of our culture. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about culture being integrated. So, one of the dominant kind of tenets of North America and the United States is capitalism, right? Money wins out. And so that's going to be evident in all of our behaviors, right? That's going to be evident in our spending. That's going to be evident in how we kind of define our meaning, right? One of the first questions you will ask anyone when you meet them is, "What do you do?" Right? Well, we all do lots of different things, but we all also know that that question is really asking, um, what job do you hold? How are you employed? Right? So in the United States, we often talk about working or living to work instead of working to live. In other places, we see it with our relatives that live in Germany and Switzerland. They don't define their value or worth or identity based on the job they hold. If they work retail, they're fine with that because retail is just kind of the means to the end. The end is earning enough money to survive off of, to live off of. And so, we, by contrast, we wrap up so much of our identity into the jobs that we hold, and we put people on quote unquote career paths at young ages, expecting them to develop some sort of passion for the job that they are eventually going to do. So, if we were to talk about core values of New Mexico versus core values of the United States, right? We might say that in the United States, it's capitalism, it's freedom, it's democracy, etc. In New Mexico, we also might tie in family. New Mexico, as a state, does have, for example, a lot more expanded family households. People living with relatives that are not just their partners and offspring, right? But living in extended family households or expanded family households. What else would be a key cultural feature or core value of New Mexico? Maybe Roman Catholicism, right? Maybe this interesting mix of Hispanic features, Anglo features, and indigenous features. And maybe we would define it by things like green chili and the Three Sisters or fry bread. Maybe we would define it as nepotism and the good old boy network and things like that, right? There are a lot of kind of pervasive New Mexico things. The land of manana, that was the one, that was what was hardest for me to wrap my mind around that. I came from the East Coast and everything was always on this really, really fast pace. You were worried about being late. Your parents drilled into you that you always had to be punctual and on time. And then you get out here and it's like things happen, but they happen on New Mexico time instead of on like this rushed kind of driven frenetic pace. So this slide then represents kind of how integrated different aspects of culture are. In the 1950s, it was expected that most women would serve roles as wives, mothers, domestic managers, or if they worked, it was going to be in careers that were suitable for women, caretaking careers, nursing, school teachers, etc. Now we expect to women to have equal opportunity, right? To even be able to take positions of power. Now, is this perfect yet? Do we have true equality? No, of course we don't. Representation matters, right? We need to, children need to see people who look like them in whatever aspect of their identity that we're talking about in order to imagine themselves in positions like that. So we do have more women in positions of power. We do have women working as doctors, women working as engineers, etc. But we still also have quite a bit of skew, um, particularly in these in let's say um, leadership or political roles, right? Why is it such a big deal that Kamala Harris won the position of vice president, right? Well, because this is the first time in more than 200 years that a woman has won such a position of power, that a woman's been seen as competent enough, and not just a woman, but specifically a woman of color, right? So, kind of the meaning and the carryover and how this then works its way into other aspects of our culture. Um, you know, these are very important strides that we're making, and the fact that seeing women of color in positions of power can then carry over into girls kind of perceiving that they themselves could pursue positions of power. I mean, this is really meaningful and impactful.